I never let myself sit with it long enough to see the truth. After all, Adrian was the first man who made me feel like I was enough. Before him, I'd spent most of my 20s feeling invisible. I'd had a string of relationships with men who never fully saw me, who liked the way I looked in their lives, but not the actual woman behind the smile. Adrian seemed different. He knew how to say all the right things. He told me he loved that I wasn't obsessed with status, that I was the calm in the storm, that he'd never met anyone with my kind of quiet strength. I didn't realize those words were just another way of weaving me into the story he wanted to tell. 3 months in, I started to wonder why I'd never met his closest friends. He'd met mine, come to my birthday dinner, charmed everyone with stories about his business, even helped my best friend's husband move a couch across town. But whenever I suggested meeting the people he cared about, there was always a reason it wasn't the right time. "They're all over the place," he'd say, kissing my forehead. "You'll meet them soon." It never happened. In early January, we spent a weekend at a lake house he'd rented. I remember lying in bed, watching the sunrise over the water, thinking that I could see myself with this man for the rest of my life. He turned to me and said, "I've never felt this way about anyone." I believed him. Maybe that's the worst part, how completely I trusted him. I didn't know that only a few miles away another woman was planning her wedding, that while I was falling in love, he was promising forever to someone else. It would be weeks before I found out. Weeks before my entire life cracked open and I learned that love can be the most dangerous illusion of all. But that morning, in the soft light of that borrowed lake house, I believed every word. And that belief would cost me more than I ever imagined. My name is Elena Price, and I'm 31 years old. Until this year, I honestly believed I was the luckiest woman in Austin. I guess it's funny how love can make you blind, how a smile and a promise can convince you to ignore the quiet warnings in your own heart. I met Adrian Cole on an evening that felt like something out of a movie. It was late October, the night still warm enough to sit outside, and the patio of the wine bar glowed under strings of golden lights. He was there for a charity event, wearing a tailored navy suit that made him look every inch the rising entrepreneur everyone in Austin seemed to know. I was there to support a friend's nonprofit. I remember feeling awkward, standing by the silent auction table with my glass of cheap Chardonnay, trying to look like I belonged in a room full of people who had more money, more connections, more everything. And then he walked over. He smiled in that way that made it feel like the rest of the room had disappeared. He asked about the charity, about my work as a graphic designer, about the book I was reading. He didn't just pretend to listen. He actually heard me, or so I thought. By the end of the night, he had my number. 2 days later, he sent flowers to my office, sunflowers and blue hydrangeas in a clear glass vase. My coworker Emma swooned. "A man who remembers your favorite flower after one conversation?" She sighed. "Keep him." I remember laughing, but the truth is, I was already hooked. The first few months were dizzying. Adrian was thoughtful and attentive. He'd show up at my door with takeout from my favorite Thai place. He'd send texts just to say he was thinking about me. He planned little getaways, weekends in Fredericksburg wine country, drives through the hill country to watch the wildflowers bloom. Looking back, I can see it all with such clarity. The way he curated every moment so I'd never feel like I needed to ask questions. The way he made me feel chosen, special. But there were warning signs. Small things I pushed aside. He never let me visit his condo unannounced. He said he was particular about his space, that he needed privacy to decompress. He was always traveling for work, but he rarely offered details, just vague explanations about investor meetings and startup incubators. And he never posted photos of us. He claimed he was a private person, that social media was shallow, that what we had was too real to flaunt. I told myself that made sense, that maybe it was romantic. But in quiet moments, When he'd cancel plans at the last minute or go silent for a day or two, I'd feel this cold unease settle in my chest. If you've ever been in love with a liar, you know how skillfully they mix the truth with just enough fiction to keep you tethered. That January, Adrian grew more distracted. He still texted goodnight, still called me darling, still showed up with flowers. But there were longer silences between the words, little inconsistencies that started to build up like splinters under my skin. One Wednesday night, I was finishing a project late at my apartment when I realized he hadn't answered my text in over 24 hours. He'd said he was driving to Dallas for meetings, but when I called, it went straight to voicemail. I tried to be rational. He was busy. He was tired. He'd call when he could. But the unease kept growing. That Friday, he finally texted back. "Sorry, nonstop meetings. Can't wait to see you Sunday." I stared at the screen, feeling the familiar mix of relief and resentment. The old me would have accepted it without question. But something in me, maybe the part that had learned to doubt, couldn't let it go. The next day, I went out for coffee with Emma, my coworker, and one of the few people I'd confided in about my relationship. "You ever wonder if he's hiding something?" she asked carefully, stirring her latte. I bristled. "Like what?" She hesitated. "I don't know. You've been together months, but you've never met his family, never been to his place, never met his friends." I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that she didn't understand Adrian like I did. But the words stuck in my throat. Because she was right. I was tired of wondering, tired of feeling like a guest in my own life. That night, while Adrian was supposedly still in Dallas, I searched his name online. Not just the casual social media scroll I'd done before, but deeper. Wedding registries, local engagement announcements, anything that might explain the knots in my stomach. I almost wished I hadn't looked, because that's how I found it. A glossy engagement website with a pale blue background, a photo of Adrian, smiling that same disarming smile, with his arm around a woman in a white dress. Her name was Charlotte Monroe. They were getting married in April. My vision blurred as I scrolled through their story, how they'd met, how he proposed on a trip to Italy, how they'd spent 2 years building a life together. 2 years. While he was telling me he'd never felt this way about anyone, he was planning a wedding with someone else. I remember thinking I must be going crazy, that it couldn't be real. I took screenshots of everything. Then I sat there in the glow of my laptop screen, numb. All the little gaps in his stories, all the times he canceled plans, the vacations he said were for work. They all clicked into place like puzzle pieces I hadn't wanted to see. The next morning, I tried to call him. He didn't pick up. I tried again. Nothing. Around noon, he finally called back, sounding casual, too casual. "Hey, darling. Sorry, I'm just heading back from Dallas. Everything okay?" I almost dropped the phone. "Who is Charlotte?" I asked, my voice shaking. There was a pause so long I thought the line had gone dead. Then he sighed. "Elena, I can explain." Explain? Explain how I'd built a life with a man who belonged to someone else? My hands were shaking. "I don't think you can," I whispered. He tried to spin it, of course. Tried to tell me it was complicated, that he'd been meaning to end things with Charlotte, that she didn't understand him the way I did. But the words felt hollow, like echoes of a story I'd already stopped believing. I hung up without saying goodbye. After that, everything moved in slow motion. I called Emma, and she came over immediately. We sat on the couch, the engagement website open between us, and she held my hand while I tried to make sense of it. "He's a coward," she said finally, "and you are not going to let this define you." I wanted to believe her. But in the days that followed, the rumors started. People at work had seen the engagement announcement. Some assumed I'd known all along, that I'd been the other woman, the homewrecker. I walked into meetings and felt the stares, heard the whispers. By the end of the week, I'd stopped answering calls, stopped checking social media. I was devastated. But underneath the devastation, something colder was taking shape, a bitter determination. I refused to let this be the end of my story. If Adrian thought he could manipulate me into silence, he was wrong. And if Charlotte thought I was the enemy, she deserved to know the truth. I didn't know it yet, but the two of us were about to become allies in a way neither of us could have imagined. They say shame can turn you into someone you don't recognize. For the first week after I discovered the engagement, I was that person. Small, afraid, convinced that somehow this humiliation was my fault. I stopped going to the gym. I stopped answering texts from friends who wanted to check on me. I ordered takeout I barely touched. Everywhere I looked, there was some reminder. The photo of Adrian and me at a vineyard in Fredericksburg. The sunflowers he'd brought me, just because. The black sweater I'd borrowed from his closet. I thought about throwing it all away, but part of me needed the proof that I hadn't imagined it, that there had been something real, even if it turned out to be a lie. The worst part wasn't even Adrian. It was the way people looked at me. The pity in Emma's eyes when she brought over groceries, the side glances from coworkers, like they weren't sure if I was a victim or a willing accomplice. The texts from acquaintances I hadn't spoken to in years. Wow, so sorry you're in the middle of that drama. Were you really seeing him all this time? I can't believe you didn't know. I started to understand how easily a narrative could spin out of control. It didn't matter that I hadn't known, that I never would have chosen to be with someone who was engaged. To everyone else, I was just the third person. It was a kind of shame I wouldn't wish on anyone. One evening, after a particularly brutal day, 2 clients canceled projects because they weren't comfortable with the controversy. I sat in my dark apartment staring at my phone. I don't know what made me do it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe desperation. But I pulled up Charlotte Monroe's Instagram profile. It wasn't private. The first photo I saw was of her and Adrian, arms wrapped around each other on a rooftop bar. The caption read, "Can't believe I get to marry my best friend, counting down the days." She had no idea. My hands shook as I scrolled further. There were photos of the ring. Photos of them in Italy, where he'd proposed. And then, tucked between the engagement photos, a candid shot of her sitting on a bench with a book in her lap. She looked normal, unassuming, like any woman who thought she'd found her forever. That's when I realized I couldn't let him keep doing this. He'd manipulated me, lied to me, and he was still lying to her. I didn't want to be part of his deception any longer. So I did the one thing I never thought I'd do. I sent her a message. It was short, careful. "Hi, Charlotte. You don't know me, but I think we need to talk. This isn't a prank or an attack. I was in a relationship with Adrian, and I didn't know about you. Please, just hear me out." I closed the app and tossed my phone onto the couch, heart racing. What was I doing? What if she ignored me? What if she blamed me? What if this only made things worse? An hour passed. 2. Then, finally, my phone buzzed. Charlotte Monroe. Is this some kind of sick joke? I swallowed, typing carefully. No, I wish it were. I didn't know about you. He told me he wasn't seeing anyone else. I can prove everything. Another pause. Show me. I gathered every screenshot I had, our messages, photos of us together, the reservation confirmations for the weekends we'd spent away. I sent them all, one after another, my hands trembling so badly I could barely keep hold of the phone. The typing dots appeared, then disappeared. For a long time, nothing. I sat there in silence, the room so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. Finally, she replied, "Where can we meet?" We settled on a coffee shop downtown. Neutral territory. The next morning, I barely slept. I put on a simple black dress and tied my hair back, hoping I looked composed. But when I arrived, my stomach twisted so hard I thought I might be sick. Charlotte was already there, sitting at a corner table. She looked smaller in person, tired, pale, like she hadn't slept either. For a moment, we just stared at each other. Then she took a shaky breath. "I thought you were lying," she said. I don't even know what I thought." "I don't blame you," I whispered. She shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "How long?" "8 months." Her face crumpled and she pressed her hand over her mouth. We spent the next hour comparing timelines. The overlaps were staggering. The weekends he'd told me he was traveling for work were the same weekends he'd been with her, planning their future. "He said he was going to therapy," she murmured, "that he needed time alone to process." "He told me he was visiting investors," I said. We fell silent. I realized then that she wasn't my enemy. She was just another woman he'd lied to. By the end of the conversation, there was only one thing we both knew for certain. He couldn't get away with it. We were done being manipulated. And we were done being silent. Sitting across from Charlotte that morning, I felt something click into place, like all the confusion and shame I'd been carrying finally had somewhere to go. It wasn't my fault. And it wasn't hers either. When you spend months believing someone loves you, it feels impossible to untangle the lies from the truth. But now, with the evidence spread across the cafe table, neither of us could pretend anymore. "I'm so sorry," I said, my voice breaking. "I swear, I didn't know." She shook her head, wiping her cheek with the back of her hand. "I believe you. He's been doing this for longer than either of us knew." I swallowed. "What are you going to do?" Her jaw tightened. "Call off the wedding, obviously." "And tell people?" Charlotte took a slow breath, her eyes locked on mine. "I don't want to be another woman who just walks away in shame while he moves on like nothing happened." It was strange. We'd only just met, but there was a solidarity between us that felt unshakable. "He doesn't get to act like we're the ones who should be embarrassed," I said. Her gaze sharpened. "No, he doesn't." That was the moment we decided we weren't going to hide. Over the next week, Charlotte and I spoke almost every day. We compared messages, pieced together the timeline of his duplicity, and gathered proof, screenshots, emails, photos, everything. It was surreal, realizing how perfectly he'd compartmentalized his life, how easily he'd lied to both of us. Charlotte sent me a picture of her engagement ring sitting on the bathroom counter. "I took it off," she texted. "It's like it was never real." I understood exactly what she meant. One evening, as I sat in the loft sorting through screenshots, Emma came by with takeout. She watched me lay out the evidence like I was preparing for trial. "You're really going through with this?" she asked gently. I nodded. "He built this lie so carefully. He made us feel like we were the ones who should be ashamed, but he's the one who should be exposed." Emma sighed. "Just be sure you're ready. This is going to be a lot." "I know," I whispered, "but it's worse to do nothing." Charlotte felt the same. She told me she'd canceled the wedding venue and called her parents, who were devastated but supportive. But she hadn't told Adrian yet. Neither had I. We both agreed it needed to happen face to face, and that the people who believed his stories deserved to see the truth. So when Charlotte suggested we confront him together, I didn't hesitate. She was planning a small engagement party, a final event before the wedding invitations went out. "We'll do it there," she said over the phone, her voice steady. "He won't expect it. He'll think I'm still pretending everything's fine." I imagined the look on his face when he saw both of us standing together. The thought made something dark and fierce bloom in my chest. "I'll be there," I said. The morning of the party, I woke up nauseated. I'd barely slept, My mind kept replaying all the moments I'd believed in him, the way he'd held my face in his hands and whispered, "You're the only one." I thought of how easily he'd said it, how easily he'd lied. Charlotte texted me at noon. "Tonight's the night." I dressed carefully, choosing a simple navy dress. Nothing flashy. Nothing that would make me look like I'd come to start a fight, because the truth was, I hadn't. I'd come to end one. The party was at a rooftop bar downtown. When I arrived, I could see Adrian through the glass doors, laughing with a group of people, one hand curled casually around a whiskey glass. He looked exactly the way he always did, polished, charismatic, perfectly in control. I felt my stomach turn, but I didn't let it stop me. Charlotte met me by the elevators. She looked beautiful and heartbreakingly tired, wearing a pale blue dress I imagined she'd once planned to wear for her bridal shower. "Ready?" she asked softly. I nodded. "Let's do it." We walked in together, side by side. Conversations faltered. People turned to look. Adrian's smile faded when he saw me. For a moment, he looked almost amused, like he thought this was some kind of coincidence. Then he spotted Charlotte next to me, her chin lifted in defiance. I watched his face drain of color. "Charlotte," he began, voice smooth but tight. "What's going on?" She didn't answer. She stepped forward and set her phone on a high-top table. The screen lit up with a photo of the two of us together, me and Adrian, arms wrapped around each other, smiling. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "Oh my God." Charlotte's voice was steady. "Go ahead, Adrian. Tell everyone how you were engaged to me while you were living a second life with her." He opened his mouth, closed it again. I stepped forward. My hands were shaking, but I kept my voice clear. "You told me you loved me," I said. "You told her the same thing. You made both of us feel like we were crazy for asking questions." He tried to interrupt, but Charlotte held up her hand. "No," she said, her voice like a blade. "You don't get to talk now." He looked around the room, like he was searching for someone to defend him, but no one spoke. In that silence, I felt something lift off my chest. For the first time since this began, I wasn't ashamed. I wasn't the other woman. I was just another person he'd tried to manipulate. And I wasn't going to let him rewrite the story. I will never forget the way Adrian looked at us in that moment. It wasn't remorse. It wasn't even fear. It was calculation, like he was already sifting through excuses and half-truths, trying to decide which mask to put on. Charlotte didn't give him the chance. She reached into her purse and pulled out a small stack of printed screenshots, the text messages he'd sent each of us, the overlapping plans, the photos from weekends he'd claimed were business trips. "Since you're so good at spinning stories," she said, her voice ringing out over the hush, "I thought we'd bring receipts." Someone near the bar let out a low whistle. A few people turned away, uncomfortable. But most just stared, like they couldn't look away from the wreckage. Adrian's jaw flexed. He reached for the papers, but Charlotte pulled them back. "No," she said sharply. "You don't get to pretend this is a misunderstanding." He looked at me then, and for the first time, I saw exactly what he was. Not some tragic romantic caught between two women, but a man who had always believed he was too clever to be held accountable. "Elena," he started, his voice soft, the way it used to be when he'd convinced me everything was fine. "I never meant for you to get hurt." I almost laughed. "But I did get hurt," I said, my hands trembling. "And so did she. You knew exactly what you were doing." He swallowed, glancing at the crowd gathering around us. "I cared about you," he insisted. Charlotte shook her head. "You cared about yourself." For a moment, nobody spoke. In that silence, I felt something I hadn't expected. Clarity. I didn't love him anymore. I didn't even recognize him. I looked around the room, at all the people who had believed his version of events, The friends and colleagues who had toasted his engagement, the acquaintances who'd whispered that I was the villain. I took a breath and spoke louder than I ever had in my life. For anyone who thinks I was the problem, I said, my voice carrying across the rooftop. I didn't know about any of this. I was lied to, just like she was. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. I could see faces softening, people shifting uncomfortably, realizing maybe they'd judged too quickly. Adrian looked from me to Charlotte, his expression hardening. "This is ridiculous," he spat. "You're both making a scene." Charlotte tilted her head, her eyes cold. "Funny. You never complained when you were the one controlling the story." He opened his mouth again, but she turned to the crowd. "If any of you wonder who the real liar is," she said, her voice clear and steady, "look at who's trying to shut us up." Adrian's face went red. He set his glass down so hard it cracked. "I'm done here," he hissed. And then he walked out, through the crowd of former friends and supporters who parted around him without a word. For a moment, the only sound was the music drifting from the speakers, some upbeat pop song that felt almost obscene in the silence he left behind. I stood there, my hands still shaking, feeling the adrenaline drain out of me all at once. Charlotte turned to me. "You okay?" I nodded slowly. "I think so." A woman I didn't know stepped forward and touched my arm. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "We didn't know. None of us did." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "Thank you." Around us, people started to murmur, gathering their coats and drinks, dispersing as if they weren't sure what to do now that the performance was over. But for me, it didn't feel like a performance. It felt like liberation. Charlotte and I stepped out onto the balcony, the night air cool against our flushed faces. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, she let out a shaky laugh. "Did you ever think this is where we'd end up?" I smiled, exhausted. "I didn't think I'd ever meet you." She looked at me, her eyes bright with something that wasn't quite sadness anymore. "I'm glad I did," she said. "Me too." We stood there in silence, watching the lights of the city flicker in the distance. Inside, the staff was clearing glasses and folding up tables. The night was ending, but I felt like something else was just beginning. A life I didn't have to share with a man who lied to everyone, including himself. A life that belonged entirely to me. When I finally left the rooftop, I felt taller, lighter. I didn't care what people said about me anymore. They could whisper, they could speculate. I knew the truth, and I knew that the only person I needed to answer to was myself. After that night, everything changed. In the days that followed, the story spread faster than I ever could have imagined. People who hadn't spoken to me in months were suddenly sliding into my DMs, offering sympathy or curiosity or both. I ignored most of them. I didn't owe anyone explanations anymore. Charlotte and I stayed in touch. At first, it was daily, exchanging updates about all the fallout Adrian was dealing with, the canceled wedding contracts, the awkward calls from friends and colleagues, the rumors that he'd left town to clear his head. Neither of us cared where he went. We'd done what we needed to do. After a week or so, the adrenaline wore off. The rush of vindication gave way to something quieter. Grief, maybe. Or simply exhaustion. It's easy to think that exposing the truth will instantly heal you. But the reality is, even when you reclaim your story, there are still scars. I'd spent 8 months believing I'd finally found someone who saw me, someone who respected me, who loved me. Admitting that none of it was real was harder than anything else. But I also knew this. I'd rather live with that truth than spend one more day tangled in his lies. A month later, I started seeing a therapist. It felt cliché, sitting on a beige sofa, talking about my feelings. But I needed it. I needed to understand how I'd gotten so easily drawn into his world. One afternoon, my therapist asked me, "What do you think you were searching for in him?" I stared at the floor for a long time before I answered. "Validation," I said finally. "I wanted someone to tell me I was enough." She nodded gently. "And do you believe that now?" I thought about everything I'd survived. The humiliation, the whispers, the way I'd stood beside Charlotte and refused to back down. "Yes," I said. "I do." The thing about being broken is that you get to decide how you rebuild. I started small. I painted my living room a deep, rich green, something that felt alive. I bought new sheets, fresh flowers every week. I deleted all the photos of Adrian. One morning, I woke up and realized I wasn't thinking about him anymore, and that felt like victory. Charlotte moved out of the condo she'd shared with him and started over in a small apartment on the east side. We met for coffee sometimes, and though we never said it outright, I think we both knew we'd always share a bond no one else could fully understand. Once, as we sipped iced lattes in the spring sunshine, she looked over at me and said, "It feels like we survived a cult." I laughed because it was true. Adrian had been the charismatic leader of a tiny world he'd built from lies, and we were the ones who finally burned it down. About 3 months after the confrontation, I got a message request on Instagram. "Adrian Cole wants to send you a message." I didn't open it. I deleted it without reading a single word. I already knew what it would say. Some mixture of excuses and nostalgia. The same tired script he'd used to keep us all believing in him. But I wasn't interested in his story anymore. I had my own. One that didn't revolve around being chosen by someone who never deserved me. At work, the whispers eventually faded. People moved on to other gossip, other scandals. A few colleagues even apologized for assuming the worst. I accepted their apologies politely, but I didn't let any of them too close. I'd learned the hard way how easily perception can be twisted. These days, I measure my life in different ways. Not by how loved I am by someone else, but by how much I trust myself. Not by whether other people approve, but by whether I'm being honest about who I am and what I deserve. And the thing I deserve most is peace. If you're watching this because you've been where I was, if you've been lied to, if you've been shamed for someone else's choices, please hear me. You are not the villain in their story. You are not the villain in your own either. You are allowed to rebuild, to start over, to hold your head high, even if the world wants you to bow it. I spent a long time thinking being loved by someone like Adrian would finally make me whole. But it turns out I was never broken. Just believing in the wrong person. These days, I still go to the same coffee shop where Charlotte and I first sat across from each other, terrified and furious and heartsick. I sit by the window watching people hurry past on their way to work or love or somewhere in between, and I think about how different my life feels now, how much stronger I am, how much braver. And if you asked me if I regret any of it, the heartbreak, the public shame, the way it all fell apart, I'd tell you this: no. Because sometimes the worst thing that ever happens to you is the thing that sets you free. Thank you for listening to my story. If you know someone who needs to hear this, share it with them. If you've survived something similar, I'd love to hear how you reclaimed your own story. And if no one has told you today, you are enough, exactly as you are.